In 52 BC, Julius Caesar did something no general had ever attempted. He trapped 80,000 Gallic warriors inside a fortress, then built a wall around them. But here's the insane part. 330,000 relief warriors arrived to save them. Caesar's 60,000 Romans now faced 250,000 enemies attacking from both sides simultaneously. Think about those numbers for a second. Surrounded on the inside and outside, 250,000 Gauls against 60,000 legionaries with nowhere to retreat. By the end of this video, you'll understand how Caesar achieved the impossible. I'm about to reveal 3 things that will change how you see ancient warfare forever. First, the engineering marvel that turned mathematics into murder. 14 miles of double fortifications built in weeks. Second, the moment Caesar's Gallic cavalry switched sides and nearly destroyed him. And third, why Vercingetorix, after uniting all of Gaul against Rome, surrendered without a final fight. But here's what makes this truly unbelievable. How did Romans build 2 massive wall systems while under constant attack? Why did the relief army's numerical advantage become their fatal weakness? What made 70,000 men starve rather than attempt a breakout? To understand how Caesar turned a death trap into Rome's greatest triumph, we need to go back to when Gaul was burning. Gaul had been bleeding for 7 years. Julius Caesar's legions had crushed tribe after tribe, turning proud warriors into slaves, burning villages that had stood for centuries. Roman tax collectors walked through sacred groves. Roman merchants profited from Gallic grain. For the first time in their history, the fractured tribes of Gaul found a leader they could all follow. A young chieftain named Vercingetorix, who understood that Rome could only be beaten if every Gallic warrior fought as one. What happened next would bring the Roman war machine to its knees and force Caesar into the most desperate gamble of his life. The numbers tell the story of Rome's arrogance. 7 years of campaigning had killed over 1 million Gauls. Another million had been sold into slavery. Caesar's commentaries boasted of these figures like a merchant tallying profits. 53 tribes reduced to submission. 400 towns burned. The Senate in Rome celebrated each dispatch with public games. But here's what those victory reports didn't reveal. The legions were exhausted, scattered across a hostile land 3 times the size of Italy, and Caesar's political enemies were circling like wolves. Vercingetorix was 25 years old when he raised his standard in Gergovia. The son of a tribal king, educated in Roman ways, he'd watched Caesar's tactics for years and learned their fatal weakness. Romans won battles, but they couldn't win the land. Their supply lines stretched for hundreds of miles. Their foraging parties were vulnerable. Their allies were terrified into submission, not loyal. He called a secret council of the tribes in winter, when Romans typically withdrew to their fortresses. What he proposed was revolutionary total war. Here's where it gets insane. Vercingetorix convinced the fractured, feuding tribes of Gaul to do something they'd never done. Fight as one nation. The Arverni, the Carnutes, the Senones, the Parisii tribes that had warred against each other for generations swore oaths on their sacred weapons. By spring, 200,000 warriors had rallied to his banner. But Vercingetorix didn't just gather numbers. He changed the rules of engagement entirely. Scorched earth. That was his masterstroke. Instead of defending towns that Romans could besiege, he burned them himself. 20 cities put to the torch by Gallic hands, denying Caesar shelter and supplies. Instead of meeting legions in open battle where Roman discipline dominated, he unleashed cavalry to harass supply columns, cut off foragers, bleed the legions through 1,000 small cuts. Roman soldiers began to starve. Caesar's Germanic cavalry, mercenaries loyal only to pay, started deserting. By late spring, Caesar faced a crisis he'd never encountered. His army was scattered, hungry, and losing control of the territory. Gallic attacks came from everywhere and nowhere. Towns that had submitted to Rome suddenly rose in rebellion, massacring their Roman garrisons. In Orleans, every Roman citizen was butchered in a single night, hundreds dead, their bodies thrown to the dogs. The message was clear. Rome's grip on Gaul was slipping. Think about what this meant. Caesar's entire reputation rested on his Gallic conquest. Failure here would destroy him politically back in Rome, where his enemies already controlled the Senate. His legions, unpaid for months, grumbled about mutiny. His supplies dwindled daily. And now, for the first time in 7 years, he faced a Gallic leader who understood that beating Rome required more than courage, it required strategy. But Vercingetorix made one critical miscalculation. He believed his scorched earth tactics and mobility would force Caesar to retreat back to Italy. Instead, Caesar did something no one expected, something so desperate and brilliant it would become the most studied siege in military history. He marched his starving legions straight toward the one place Vercingetorix thought was impregnable. Caesar had won every battle, but he was losing the war. His legions were scattered across Gaul, stretched impossibly thin. 60,000 Romans trying to control 3 million hostile Gauls across a territory the size of modern France. The mathematics of empire had turned against him. Vercingetorix saw the opening and struck with brutal intelligence, scorched earth tactics that destroyed Roman supply lines, hit-and-run attacks that bled the legions dry, and a strategic retreat that drew Caesar deeper into hostile territory. By summer, Caesar's army was starving, his allies were abandoning him, and Rome's Senate was whispering that the great general had finally overreached. The supply situation had become catastrophic by June. Roman legions required roughly 1,600 tons of grain per month to remain operational. Caesar's 60,000 men needed that grain from somewhere, and Vercingetorix had systematically destroyed every source. Granaries burned, crops torched in the fields before harvest. Allied tribes who'd promised provisions suddenly sent apologetic messages. Gallic raiders had seized everything. Caesar's quartermasters reported food reserves for less than 2 weeks. After that, the legions would begin to disintegrate. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you about this phase of the war. Caesar was trapped in a strategic nightmare of his own creation. Every victory had pushed him deeper into Gaul, farther from supply bases in Roman-controlled territory. His lines of communication stretched back 200 miles through hostile country. Convoys required half a legion just for protection, and even then, Vercingetorix's cavalry would strike from tree lines, slaughter the escorts, burn the wagons, and vanish before reinforcements arrived. In 1 week alone, 4 major supply columns were destroyed. That's over 300 tons of grain gone in flames, along with 800 legionaries dead. The desertion numbers paint the clearest picture of Roman desperation. Caesar's Germanic cavalry, 4,000 horsemen he'd hired at enormous cost, began slipping away in the night. By early July, he'd lost half of them. They weren't being defeated in battle. They were simply leaving because Caesar couldn't pay them anymore. The Roman treasury that funded this campaign was empty. Gallic gold that had paid previous year's expenses wasn't flowing because Gaul was in open rebellion. Think about what this meant for Roman tactical flexibility. No cavalry meant no reconnaissance, no pursuit, no screening for infantry movements. Caesar was fighting blind. Then Vercingetorix pulled off his masterpiece of psychological warfare. He attacked Gorgobina, a town of the Boii tribe, one of Caesar's few remaining Gallic allies. The message was explicit: ally with Rome and we'll burn you out. Caesar faced an impossible choice: ignore the attack and lose every remaining Gallic supporter, or march to relieve Gorgobina and walk straight into Vercingetorix's trap. The Gallic commander had positioned his main army, 70,000 warriors, between Caesar and the besieged town, forcing a confrontation on ground of Vercingetorix's choosing. Caesar, desperate and running out of options, attacked anyway. The Battle of Gergovia in mid-June became his first major defeat in Gaul. Roman legions assaulted Vercingetorix's fortified camp on high ground and were bloodily repulsed. 700 legionaries killed, including 46 centurions, the veteran backbone of Roman military power. For comparison, Caesar had lost fewer than 300 men total in some of his previous Gallic campaigns. This single defeat cost him more veteran leadership than entire years of conquest. But here's where the situation went from bad to catastrophic. News of Gergovia spread across Gaul like wildfire. The Aedui, Rome's most powerful and long-standing Gallic allies, received word that Caesar had been defeated. Their leaders met in secret council and made a decision that nearly ended Roman Gaul entirely. They declared for Vercingetorix. 10,000 Aedui warriors who'd been fighting alongside Caesar suddenly became enemies. The tribe that controlled the central Gallic heartland, that had provided supplies and intelligence, that had given Rome legitimacy in Gaul, gone. Caesar watched his strategic situation collapse in real time. Surrounded by hostiles, low on food, bleeding men to desertion and defeat, he now faced a united Gallic nation of unprecedented size. The only question left was whether Caesar would survive long enough to retreat back to Roman territory, or whether Vercingetorix would trap and annihilate him first. That answer would come at a fortress town neither commander expected to become history's most famous siege. Alesia rose from the Burgundian plateau like a natural fortress designed by the gods themselves. Steep slopes on every side, water sources inside, storage for grain to last months. When Vercingetorix retreated there with 80,000 warriors, Caesar faced an impossible choice: attack uphill against fortified positions and lose half his army, or retreat and admit defeat before all of Gaul. Instead, Caesar made a decision so audacious that his own officers thought he'd gone mad. He would build a wall around the entire mountain, not to breach the fortress, but to starve it. 11 miles of fortifications encircling Alesia completely. It was engineering on a scale never attempted in military history. The geography tells you everything about why this seemed impossible. Alesia sat on a plateau 1,500 feet above the surrounding plain, roughly 1.5 miles long and half a mile wide at its broadest point. The eastern and western approaches featured nearly vertical cliffs. The northern and southern slopes, while less steep, still rose at angles that turned charging uphill into suicide. 2 rivers, the Osse and the Osserane, flanked the position, providing fresh water and additional natural barriers. Vercingetorix had chosen perfectly. Any army attempting a direct assault would lose thousands just reaching the walls. Here's what makes Caesar's decision truly insane. Building a circumvallation, a siege wall completely encircling an enemy position, required holding a perimeter of 11 miles with 60,000 men, while 80,000 enemies sat on high ground watching your every move. The mathematics seemed impossible. That's roughly 5,000 legionaries per mile, spread thin enough that concentrated attacks could punch through anywhere. Roman military doctrine said you needed 3 to 1 numerical advantage to successfully besiege a fortified position. Caesar had a 1-to-1 ratio at best, and he was the one building fortifications while under observation. But Caesar understood something Vercingetorix didn't. Time was now Rome's ally. Every day the siege continued. Vercingetorix's 80,000 warriors consumed their food stores. Caesar's engineers calculated that Alesia's granaries held perhaps 30 days' worth of provisions for that many men. After that, starvation would do what Roman swords couldn't. The question was whether Caesar could complete his fortifications and hold them long enough for hunger to break Gallic resolve. The engineering specifications reveal the scale of Roman ambition. The main ditch would be 15 feet deep and 15 feet wide, big enough that a man couldn't easily climb out even without defenders trying to kill him. Behind that, a 12-foot rampart topped with wooden palisades and sharpened stakes. Watchtowers every 80 feet, each manned by a 10-man contubernium. 23 full forts at key intervals, essentially mini-fortresses capable of independent defense. The material requirements defied belief. Over 100,000 stakes for the palisade, 40,000 cubic yards of earth to move, timber from entire forests. On the first day of construction, late August, Vercingetorix sent his cavalry to disrupt the work. 15,000 Gallic horsemen thundered down from Alesia, attempting to scatter the Roman construction crews. Caesar had anticipated this. His remaining German cavalry, the few loyalists who'd stayed, met them in the plain, while legionaries formed defensive squares around the engineers. The cavalry battle raged for 3 hours. The Germans, outnumbered 3 to 1, held through sheer desperation. When the Gallic cavalry finally withdrew, they left 800 dead on the field. The Romans lost 200, but here's what that cavalry battle revealed to both commanders. Vercingetorix had tested Caesar's defenses and found them vulnerable but holding. More critically, Caesar now knew that Vercingetorix would contest every foot of construction. The race was on. Could Roman engineers complete the circumvallation before Gallic cavalry destroyed them, or before relief forces arrived to trap Caesar between two armies? That night, Vercingetorix made a decision that would haunt the siege. He sent his cavalry away. All 15,000 riders, led by his most trusted commanders, rode out through gaps in the incomplete Roman lines. Their mission: spread across Gaul and summon every warrior from every tribe. Bring them back to Alesia and crush Caesar between hammer and anvil. The messages they carried promised simple mathematics. If every tribe sent their warriors, they'd assemble a force of 200,000 men or more. Caesar's scouts brought him this intelligence within hours. The nightmare scenario was unfolding exactly as he'd feared. But instead of retreating while he still could, Caesar gave an order that stunned his own staff officers. They would build a second wall, not just to pen Vercingetorix in, but to keep the relief army out. His 60,000 Romans would stand between two walls, facing enemies on both sides, in the most desperate defensive position any Roman army had ever attempted. 40,000 legionaries became builders overnight. Every soldier carried an axe, a saw, a shovel. Caesar had learned that Roman victories were built with sweat before blood. The circumvallation began taking shape with mechanical precision. 11 miles of trenches 15 feet wide and 15 feet deep. Behind them, a rampart 12 feet high topped with sharpened stakes. Watchtowers every 80 feet, 23 forts at strategic intervals. But here's what makes this insane. They built it all in 3 weeks while under constant attack from Vercingetorix's cavalry. Gallic riders would thunder down from Alesia trying to break the construction crews. Roman soldiers would drop their tools, grab shields, and form testudos before returning to their digging. The wall rose despite the blood. The work schedule reveals Roman discipline at its most brutal. Each legion worked in 8-hour shifts, rotating around the clock. That meant construction never stopped, dawn to dusk to dawn again. The sound of picks breaking earth and axes felling timber echoed continuously around Alesia's base. A legionary would spend 8 hours digging, 8 hours on guard duty watching for Gallic attacks, and 8 hours sleeping. Then repeat. For 3 weeks straight. The human cost of this pace was staggering. Men collapsed from exhaustion. Hands bled through bandages. Backs gave out from moving earth. But the alternative was death, and every legionary knew it. Here's what the engineering manuals don't tell you. Moving 40,000 cubic yards of earth without modern equipment meant every cubic foot was dug by hand, lifted in wicker baskets, and carried to the rampart. Do the mathematics. Each basket held roughly 1 cubic foot of earth. That's over 1 million individual basket loads moved by hand over 3 weeks. The dirt under fingernails, the muscle fatigue, the monotonous horror of knowing that missing your quota might mean the wall wouldn't be ready when the relief army arrived. This was engineering as existential terror. The Gallic harassment attacks came like clockwork. Every afternoon, around the same time, Vercingetorix would send sortie parties 500 to 1,000 warriors streaming down from Alesia to disrupt specific sections of construction. They'd identified the pattern, hit the crews when they were most exhausted, late in their 8-hour shift. Roman officers learned to anticipate. Cohorts designated as rapid reaction forces would be positioned behind the most vulnerable work sections. When Gallic war cries echoed down the slopes, legionaries would execute a practiced drill drop tools, grab weapons stacked nearby, form defensive formations in under 90 seconds. But on September 3rd, Vercingetorix tried something different. He sent his entire remaining force, 60,000 infantry, in a massive daylight assault against the incomplete northern section of the circumvallation. It wasn't meant to break out. It was meant to destroy the fortifications and force Caesar to start over. Gallic warriors poured down the slopes like a human avalanche, hitting Roman positions with everything they had. For 6 hours, legionaries fought hand-to-hand along 3 miles of incomplete fortifications, while engineers frantically tried to reinforce weak points behind the fighting line. The casualties from that single day: 1,200 Romans dead or seriously wounded, over 4,000 Gauls. But here's what mattered: the walls held. Barely. Sections of rampart were torn down, towers burned. Entire portions of the ditch were filled with Gallic corpses that later had to be cleared. Yet, when Vercingetorix's warriors retreated back to Alesia at sunset, the circumvallation still encircled them. Roman engineers worked through the night repairing damage, and by dawn, the fortifications stood again. Think about what that assault revealed. Vercingetorix had thrown everything at Caesar's defenses and failed to break them. He'd gambled 60,000 warriors on a single desperate attack and accomplished nothing except proving that Roman engineering could withstand direct assault. The psychological shift was seismic. Gallic warriors retreating back into Alesia now understood they were truly trapped. The walls that had seemed like temporary annoyances were becoming permanent prisons. By September 15th, 3 weeks after construction began, the circumvallation was complete. 11 miles of continuous fortifications, impregnable from the inside. Vercingetorix could no longer interfere with Caesar's siege operations. But Caesar's engineers weren't finished. They'd built the cage. Now they had to build the shield, because somewhere out there, 200,000 Gallic warriors were marching to break their general free, and when they arrived, Caesar's 60,000 would be the ones surrounded. The contravallation, the second wall facing outward, began rising the very next day. The Romans now faced a race against time that would make the first construction phase look leisurely by comparison. Then disaster struck. Caesar's Gallic cavalry mercenaries he'd hired from German tribes met Vercingetorix's riders in open battle near the incomplete walls. The fighting was brutal, but numbers told. The Gallic cavalry shattered Caesar's horsemen, then did something that changed everything. They switched sides. Right there on the battlefield, hundreds of Caesar's cavalry declared for Vercingetorix and charged at their former Roman allies. Caesar watched his mobile strike force evaporate in minutes. Now he had no cavalry to scout, to pursue, to screen his flanks. The one advantage Romans had always maintained, tactical flexibility through mounted troops, was gone. Vercingetorix's messengers rode out from Alesia that very day, and Caesar knew exactly what message they carried. The battle had started at midday on September 8th, just as Roman engineers were marking out the contravallation's outer perimeter. Vercingetorix sent his remaining cavalry, 8,000 riders, in one last massive sortie before they departed to summon the relief force. They hit Caesar's German mercenaries in the open plain west of Alesia. The clash of 4,000 Germans against 8,000 Gauls should have been a calculated risk. Instead, it became a catastrophe that nearly ended the siege before it truly began. Here's what Caesar's own commentaries barely mention. His German cavalry had been unpaid for 2 months. Promises of Gallic plunder had kept them loyal through the summer's disasters, but now those promises looked hollow. Caesar was besieging a fortress, not sacking wealthy towns. There would be no gold, no slaves, no immediate reward, just more fighting against impossible odds. The German chieftains had been quietly negotiating with Vercingetorix's emissaries for days. The battle was their audition for switching sides. The fighting lasted 90 minutes before the betrayal revealed itself. Initially, the Germans held their ground despite being outnumbered 2-1. Roman legionaries watching from the incomplete fortifications saw what looked like a standard cavalry engagement. Charges, countercharges, the dust of thousands of horses churning the plain into chaos. Then, at roughly 1:30 in the afternoon, an entire wing of German cavalry, approximately 1,500 horsemen, simply stopped fighting Gallic warriors and turned their weapons on their fellow Germans who remained loyal to Caesar. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. German riders who'd been fighting back-to-back suddenly had enemies behind them. The formations collapsed into complete chaos. Loyal Germans tried to fight in all directions simultaneously. Gallic cavalry, sensing the disintegration, pressed their assault with renewed fury. Within minutes, the entire Roman cavalry force was in full flight, streaming back toward the Roman lines in complete disorder. The casualties tell the story. 1,200 German cavalrymen dead or captured, another 800 wounded. Of the 4,000 who'd ridden out that morning, barely 2,000 made it back to Roman lines intact. Think about what this meant tactically. Cavalry in ancient warfare served as the eyes and ears of an army. Without mounted scouts, Caesar couldn't monitor enemy movements beyond visual range. He couldn't pursue fleeing enemies or prevent messengers from leaving Alesia. He couldn't screen his flanks during battle or raid enemy supply lines. The loss of cavalry didn't just reduce Roman combat power. It blinded Caesar strategically at the exact moment he needed intelligence most. But here's where it gets worse. As the surviving Germans retreated in chaos, Vercingetorix's cavalry didn't pursue to slaughter them. Instead, they formed up, organized into columns, and began riding away from Alesia entirely. Caesar, watching from the walls, understood immediately. Those weren't random raiders leaving. Those were messengers carrying word to every corner of Gaul. The message was simple and devastating. Caesar is trapped at Alesia with no cavalry. He's building walls, but he's blind and vulnerable. Send every warrior. We can destroy him. Roman scouts counted the departing horsemen, roughly 7,000 riders, fanning out in every direction like spokes from a wheel. They'd ride to the Aedui, the Arverni, the Sequani, the Senones, every major tribe. Within days, the call to arms would reach the Atlantic coast and the Rhine frontier. Within weeks, the largest army Gaul had ever assembled would be marching toward Alesia. And Caesar, his mobile forces shattered, his cavalry destroyed, could do nothing to stop the messengers or even know exactly when that massive relief force would arrive. That night, Caesar called his senior officers to council. The question was simple: retreat now while the route south remained open, or continue the siege knowing that 250,000 enemy warriors were gathering in the darkness beyond Roman sight. His officers were divided. Labienus, his most trusted commander, argued for immediate withdrawal. The cavalry disaster had made their position untenable. They couldn't scout, couldn't maneuver, couldn't even know when the relief army approached until it appeared on the horizon. Caesar gave the order that would define the entire siege. They would stay. They would finish both walls, and they would face whatever came from the darkness. But first, his engineers would build defenses unlike anything Roman military doctrine had ever conceived. Death traps that would multiply Roman strength and turn Gallic numbers into a fatal disadvantage. Caesar's scouts brought the news that turned every Roman's blood to ice. A relief army was gathering. Every tribe in Gaul was sending warriors. The estimates defied belief: 250,000 men marching to break the siege. Caesar now faced annihilation. The Romans were trapped between Alesia's 80,000 and a relief force that outnumbered them 4-1. Lesser generals would have retreated. Caesar built a second wall, the Converges, a 14-mile outer fortification facing outward to hold back the coming storm. His 60,000 legionaries now stood between two walls, surrounded on both sides, about to face the largest army ever assembled in Western European history. The mathematics of survival had become impossible. The engineering specifications for the Converges exceeded even the circumvallation's ambition. 14 miles of fortifications, instead of 11, 3 additional miles because the outer perimeter needed to encompass more terrain to prevent the relief army from simply bypassing Caesar's position. Same design: 15-foot ditches, 12-foot ramparts, watchtowers every 80 feet, forts at strategic intervals. But this time, Roman engineers had to complete it in just 2 weeks. The relief army was already gathering. Scouts reported tribal contingents departing from territories as far as 200 miles away. Here's what makes this construction phase truly insane. Legionaries were now working on both walls simultaneously. Half the army strengthening the inner circumvallation, half building the outer converges. That meant only 30,000 men available for each project, half the workforce of the first construction phase, trying to build even more extensive fortifications in less time. The work shifts extended to 10 hours. Sleep dropped to 6 hours per day. Men began collapsing at their posts from sheer exhaustion. The material requirements defied Roman logistics. Engineers calculated they needed an additional 120,000 stakes for the palisades, 50,000 more cubic yards of earth to move, timber from forests that had already been heavily logged during the first phase. Roman work parties had to range farther from the siege lines to find suitable trees, which meant exposing themselves to Gallic raiding parties. In 1 week, 3 separate logging expeditions were ambushed. 200 legionaries died cutting wood not in battle, but as laborers murdered with axes still in their hands. But Caesar's engineers added something to the contravallation that hadn't existed on the inner wall. They positioned it to take advantage of every piece of favorable terrain they could find. The northern section ran along a ridgeline that gave Roman defenders height advantage. The western section incorporated a stream as a natural moat. The southern section used a series of small hills to create natural strong points. Where the circumvallation had been a geometric exercise encircling Alesia, the contravallation was an opportunistic masterwork of tactical positioning. By September 20th, both walls stood complete. The Roman achievement defied comprehension. In just over 4 weeks, 60,000 men had built 25 miles of fortifications, moved nearly 100,000 cubic yards of earth, planted over 200,000 wooden stakes, and constructed 46 individual forts. The largest construction project in military history, built while under threat of attack from both sides, completed through pure discipline and desperation. Think about what Caesar had created. A double ring of fortifications with his army trapped between them. 60,000 Romans standing in a corridor roughly half a mile wide at most points, with 80,000 enemies inside the inner wall and 250,000 approaching from outside. No retreat route. No reinforcements possible. If either wall broke, the Roman army would be destroyed completely. That night, Vercingetorix's sentries on Alesia's walls saw signal fires appear on the distant hills to the north and west. The relief army had arrived within visual range. Inside Alesia, 80,000 Gallic warriors who'd been on half rations for 3 weeks suddenly had hope again. They would attack from the inside while their brothers attacked from the outside. Caesar's walls, no matter how impressive, couldn't withstand assault from 330,000 warriors simultaneously. What neither side knew yet was that Caesar had built more than just walls. In the space between his fortifications and the enemy positions, Roman engineers had planted nightmares that would turn charging warriors into screaming casualties before they ever reached Roman shields. Caesar turned geometry into murder. In the killing ground between the walls and the enemy, his engineers planted nightmares. First came the Lilia pits 3 feet deep, arranged in quincunx pattern like dots on dice, each containing a sharpened stake at the bottom, then covered with brush to look like solid ground. Thousands of them. Then the stimuli wooden stakes with iron hooks embedded in the earth at angles to rip through ankles and calves. Finally, the sippy sharpened logs buried at angles to form fences of death that would impale charging warriors. Roman soldiers worked night and day, planting these horrors in front of both walls. When Gallic warriors attacked, they wouldn't face just 60,000 Romans. They'd face a killing field where every step might mean death. The Lilia, named for their resemblance to lily flowers when viewed from above, represented Roman engineering at its most sadistic. Each pit was dug exactly 3 feet deep and 3 feet wide. At the bottom, a sharpened oak stake stood vertically, its point fire-hardened to penetrate leather, flesh, and bone with equal efficiency. The pits were arranged in diagonal rows, staggered so that avoiding one meant stepping toward another. Then came the crucial detail that made them truly deadly. Roman engineers covered each pit with interwoven branches and grass, making the entire field look like solid, safe ground. Here's what the military manuals don't tell you about the scale. Caesar's engineers planted over 20,000 individual lilia in the killing zones. Think about that number. 20,000 pits, each requiring manual digging in already exhausted soil, each requiring a stake to be cut, sharpened, and positioned. The labor was staggering. Teams of 8 men could complete roughly 30 pits per day. That meant the Lilia fields alone required over 5,000 man-days of brutal labor, completed in just 1 week of frantic nighttime construction. The stimuli added another layer of horror. These were smaller stakes, roughly 18 inches long, sharpened on both ends with iron barbs hammered into the wood. They were buried at shallow angles, so only 3 to 4 inches protruded above ground, just enough to catch a running man's ankle or shin. The iron hooks ensured that once the stake penetrated flesh, pulling away meant tearing muscle and tendon. Roman smiths worked around the clock, forging the barbed tips over 15,000 individual iron pieces, each one a potential crippling wound. Then came the cipi, the outermost defensive layer. These were logs roughly 5 feet long, buried at 45-degree angles with sharpened points facing outward. They created a forest of angled spears that would impale anyone who charged blindly forward. The positioning was calculated with mathematical precision. Too close together, and they'd slow an attack but not kill. Too far apart, and warriors could slip through. Roman engineers spaced them exactly 6 feet apart, close enough to create an obstacle, far enough to channel attackers into the Lilia fields behind them. But here's where Roman tactical genius truly emerged. These obstacles weren't randomly placed. Engineers positioned them to create killing funnels, narrow approaches that looked passable but led straight into concentrated death traps. The psychology was deliberate. Attacking warriors would naturally flow toward apparent gaps in the cipi forest. Those gaps led them directly into the densest concentrations of Lilia pits. Survivors of the pits would stumble into stimuli fields. Anyone who made it through all 3 obstacles would arrive at Roman walls already wounded, exhausted, and psychologically shattered. The total defensive depth from the outermost cipi to the rampart walls measured 400 feet of continuous death traps. 400 feet where every step was potentially fatal. 400 feet that multiplied Roman defensive strength by factors impossible to calculate. A charging warrior had to cross this nightmare while under arrow fire from Roman positions, while comrades around him fell screaming into invisible pits, while iron hooks tore through legs and impaling stakes rose to meet falling bodies. Caesar's engineers had transformed open ground into a meat grinder. They'd turned mathematics, the 330,000 Gallic warriors converging on Alesia from the enemy's greatest advantage, into a liability. The more men who charged those killing fields, the more bodies would pile up in the Lilia pits and stumble through the stimuli forests. The final touch revealed Caesar's complete understanding of psychological warfare. He ordered the defensive zones left visible from Alesia's walls during final construction. Vercingetorix's warriors watched Roman engineers plant the cipi, dig the Lilia, embed the stimuli. They saw the extent of the death traps. They understood what awaited any attack. That knowledge, watching your own doom being systematically constructed, was itself a weapon that drained Gallic morale days before the first assault. By September 25th, the killing fields were complete. 400 feet of engineered death on both sides of the Roman corridor. 20,000 Lilia pits waiting to swallow screaming warriors. 15,000 stimuli ready to cripple charging legs. Miles of cipi forest to impale the desperate. The stage was set for the largest battle ever fought on European soil, and the ground itself had become Rome's deadliest ally. Inside Alesia, 80,000 warriors faced a nightmare of mathematics. Vercingetorix had calculated provisions for a month, expecting the relief army within weeks. But the walls went up too fast. The contravallation locked them in. Now food dwindled, while Caesar's double fortifications grew stronger daily. Vercingetorix made the hardest decision of his life. He expelled all non-combatants from the fortress: women, children, the elderly. Thousands of Gallic civilians walked down from Alesia, expecting Roman mercy or at least passage through the lines. Caesar refused. They couldn't go forward into Roman lines. They couldn't go back into Alesia. They died in the space between the walls, starving within sight of both armies, their cries echoing across the siege lines day and night until silence took them. The food calculations inside Alesia told a story of slow-motion catastrophe. 80,000 warriors required roughly 16 tons of grain per day to maintain fighting strength. Vercingetorix's quartermaster had stockpiled 500 tons when they first retreated to the fortress, enough for 31 days at full rations. But the siege had already consumed 3 weeks of supplies. That left grain for just 10 more days. After that, starvation would begin killing warriors faster than Roman swords ever could. Here's what makes Vercingetorix's decision truly heartbreaking. The non-combatant population inside Alesia numbered roughly 20,000 people, wives, children, elderly parents of the warriors defending the walls. They consumed an additional 4 tons of grain daily. Expelling them would extend warrior rations by nearly a week. 7 more days for the relief army to arrive. 7 more days to hold out. The mathematics of survival demanded sacrifice. On September 20th, the expulsion began. Vercingetorix's heralds walked through Alesia, announcing the order. All non-combatants must leave by dawn. No exceptions, no appeals. The scenes that night defied description. Warriors said goodbye to wives they'd never see again. Mothers were separated from fighting-age sons. Old men who'd survived decades of tribal warfare were torn from grandsons who needed them. By morning, 20,000 civilians gathered at Alesia's gates, carrying what possessions they could manage, believing surely the Romans would grant safe passage. The gates opened at first light. The expelled civilians walked down the slopes toward Roman lines in a ragged column stretching nearly a mile. Women carried infants. Children held hands with siblings. The elderly supported each other on walking sticks. They approached the circumvallation, expecting mercy or at least the chance to become slaves rather than starve. Roman sentries watched them come and waited for Caesar's orders. Caesar's response was ruthless calculation disguised as military necessity. He couldn't feed 20,000 additional mouths. He couldn't allow them through his lines. They might carry intelligence about Roman dispositions to the approaching relief army. And he wouldn't send them back to Alesia to consume Vercingetorix's dwindling food. His orders were simple. No one passes. The expelled civilians found themselves trapped in the narrow space between Alesia's walls and Rome's circumvallation, a few hundred yards of no man's land that became an open-air death camp. Think about what this meant. 20,000 people, not warriors, but families, slowly dying of starvation while 2 armies watched. Roman soldiers on the walls could hear children crying for food. Gallic warriors on Alesia's ramparts could see their own wives and children wasting away. Neither side moved to help. Neither side could afford to. The dying took 2 weeks. First went the very young and very old, those without reserves to draw upon. Then nursing mothers whose milk dried up, followed by their infants. Then everyone else, one by one, until the space between the walls fell silent except for carrion birds. Roman soldiers detailed to burial duty later counted over 15,000 bodies. 5,000 somehow survived, those strong enough, desperate enough, or lucky enough to endure until events overtook them. But here's what makes this horror militarily significant. While 20,000 innocents died between the walls, Vercingetorix's food situation improved only marginally. The expelled civilians had bought him 7 additional days of full rations. 7 days that brought his warriors to the edge of October, with hope fading and bodies weakening. The relief army had to arrive soon, or the starvation would claim 80,000 warriors just as surely as it had claimed 20,000 civilians. On the night of October 1st, signal fires appeared on the northern horizon. The relief army, 240,000 strong, had finally arrived. The trapped civilians' deaths had bought just enough time for rescue to arrive. Now the question was whether that rescue would save Alesia or doom both armies together. Late September brought the thunder of approaching doom. The relief army appeared on the horizon like a migration of nations. 240,000 infantry, 8,000 cavalry. The largest military force assembled in Gaul's history, representing every tribe from the Atlantic to the Rhine. They came with supreme confidence, never had such numbers gathered under one purpose. The Romans on the outer wall watched them deploy and understood they were looking at death. 4-to-1 odds. Attacks from both sides simultaneously. No retreat possible. That night, Vercingetorix's men inside Alesia lit signal fires, and the relief army answered with flames of their own. The jaws of the trap were about to close on Caesar. The relief army's composition revealed the totality of Gallic commitment. 43 separate tribes had sent contingents. The Aedui alone contributed 35,000 warriors, their entire military-age male population. The Arverni sent 20,000. The Sequani 15,000. Smaller tribes sent what they could, 500 here, 2,000 there. This wasn't just an army. This was the collective military power of an entire civilization gathered in one place. Command fell to 4 chiefs representing Gaul's most powerful tribes. Commius of the Atrebates, who'd once been Caesar's ally before switching sides. Vercingetorix, Vercingetorix's cousin and a tactical genius in his own right. Epordorix and Viridomarus of the Aedui, leading their tribe's massive contingent. These weren't barbarian raiders. They were experienced commanders who'd studied Roman tactics and believed they'd found the formula to destroy Caesar. Overwhelming numerical superiority applied from multiple directions simultaneously. Here's what makes the relief army's arrival truly terrifying for the Romans. Caesar's scouts estimated the force at 240,000 infantry and 8,000 cavalry. But those numbers didn't include camp followers, supply handlers, engineers, smiths, and other non-combatants who swelled the total to over 300,000 people. The camp the relief army established stretched for 3 miles along the western approaches to Alesia. At night, their cooking fires looked like a city of flame. The sound of that many-men conversations, weapon maintenance, horses neighing created a continuous roar audible from Roman positions. Think about the mathematics from Caesar's perspective. 60,000 Romans now faced 80,000 warriors inside Alesia plus 240,000 in the relief army. That's 320,000 enemies total, a 5-to-1 disadvantage. But it gets worse. Caesar's forces were split between watching both walls. Roughly 30,000 legionaries faced inward toward Alesia. 30,000 faced outward toward the relief army. That meant each Roman defensive line was outnumbered nearly 3-to-1 at minimum. And if both forces attacked simultaneously, which was obviously the plan, Romans would be fighting desperate defensive battles on 2 fronts with no reserves, no reinforcements, no retreat route. Roman morale that night hit its lowest point of the entire campaign. Legionaries on the Converges watchtowers could see the relief army's vastness spreading across the landscape. They could count the tribal standards, 43 different banners, representing 43 tribes unified in hatred of Rome. Veterans who'd fought from Spain to Syria told younger soldiers they'd never seen anything like this. The whispered conversations in the Roman camps centered on one question. When the attacks came, would the walls hold? Or would they die trapped between 2 armies? But here's what the Gallic commanders didn't understand about their numerical advantage. Those 320,000 warriors would all need to attack through the same killing fields, the Lilia pits, the stimuli forests, the Sippi barriers. The death traps Caesar had planted didn't care about numbers. In fact, the more men who charged those 400 feet of engineered horror, the more bodies would pile up before Roman swords ever needed to swing. On October 2nd, the relief army's commanders met with Vercingetorix's messengers, who'd slipped out of Alesia during the night. The plan was simple and devastating. The relief army would attack the Converges from outside, while Vercingetorix's 80,000 assaulted the circumvallation from inside. Simultaneous attacks, maximum pressure, no mercy. They would crush Caesar's 60,000 between 2 massive forces and annihilate Roman presence in Gaul forever. The attack was set for noon the next day. October 3rd would see the largest battle in Western European history unfold across 14 miles of fortifications. Caesar spent that night riding the walls, speaking to his legionaries, reminding them that discipline and position had always defeated numbers throughout Roman history. But even he couldn't hide the truth visible on every horizon. They were surrounded, outnumbered 5-1, with nowhere to run and no help coming. In 12 hours, they would either hold both walls or die trying. The relief army attacked at noon, and hell itself erupted against the contravallation. 40,000 Gallic warriors hit the outer wall in a human tsunami. War cries shook the air. The sound of that many men screaming battle rage was said to be heard 5 miles away. They crashed against Roman shields with pure mass, trying to overwhelm through sheer numbers. Simultaneously, Vercingetorix's 80,000 poured out of Alesia from the inside, hitting the circumvallation. 60,000 Romans now fought on 2 fronts, stretched impossibly thin across 14 miles of fortifications. Legionaries ran from crisis point to crisis point. Caesar himself rode the interior lines, plugging gaps, rallying wavering cohorts. The Gauls discovered Caesar's death traps the hard way. Thousands fell into the Lilia, impaled on hidden stakes, their screams adding to the chaos. The initial Gallic charge hit the death traps at full sprint. Warriors running at maximum speed suddenly vanished as the ground gave way beneath them. The Lilia pits swallowed men by the hundreds, one moment charging forward, the next moment 3 feet underground with an oak stake through the gut or chest. The covering brush that made the pits invisible also trapped victims inside. Warriors who fell into the Lilia couldn't climb out the stakes, prevented upward movement, and the pit walls were too steep. They could only scream as the charge continued overhead, trampling more men into more hidden pits. Here's what makes the death traps truly devastating. The first wave of attackers discovered them through death. The second wave saw the first wave disappearing, but momentum carried them forward into the same fate. The third wave tried to avoid the obvious pits, but stepped into ones further out. Within 10 minutes of the first contact, over 3,000 Gallic warriors were impaled in the Lilia fields, dead, dying, or screaming for help that wouldn't come. Those who survived the Lilia hit the stimuli forests. Iron-barbed stakes ripped through ankles, shins, knees. Warriors fell forward onto more stakes. The barbs made extraction impossible. Pulling away meant tearing muscle from bone. Men caught in the stimuli became obstacles themselves, their writhing bodies creating additional hazards for warriors behind them. Roman archers on the walls targeted these trapped warriors specifically, not from cruelty but from tactics. Each arrow created another screaming obstacle, another reason for attacking Gauls to hesitate, to slow, to bunch up. The fortunate few who navigated both pit fields and stake forests reached the Sippi barriers only to find a forest of angled spears. The logs, positioned at precisely calculated angles, couldn't be easily pushed aside or climbed over. Warriors tried to squeeze through the 6-foot gaps and discovered those gaps funneled them directly into the densest remaining Lilia concentrations. It was geometry as mass murder. Every apparent path to safety led to death. By 12:30 p.m., the Gallic assault had been underway for 30 minutes. The casualty numbers defied belief. Roman observers estimated 5,000 attackers down dead or wounded, and not a single warrior had yet reached the actual Roman ramparts. Think about that. 5,000 casualties before combat even began. The death traps were performing exactly as Caesar had designed them, multiplying Roman defensive strength by factors the Gauls couldn't have imagined. But Gallic commanders understood something crucial. Those 5,000 dead and wounded had mapped the death traps. Now the relief army knew where the Lilia concentrated, where the stimuli forests were thinnest, which approaches offered the best chance of reaching Roman walls. The first assault was reconnaissance purchased with blood. The second wave, organized and informed, would be far more dangerous. At 1 p.m., Gallic war horns sounded again. Fresh warriors, another 40,000 from the relief army reserves, began assembling for the second assault. This time, they would follow paths cleared by the bodies of their brothers. This time, they would reach Roman shields. Caesar, watching from a watchtower, understood the mathematical reality. His death traps could kill thousands, but they couldn't kill tens of thousands. Eventually, sheer numbers would overcome engineered defenses. The real battle, legionary against warrior, shield wall against mass assault, was about to begin. And when it did, Romans would be fighting desperate defensive battles on both walls simultaneously with zero reserves available. Darkness brought no relief. The Gauls attacked through the night, using the cover of blackness to approach the walls. But Caesar had prepared for this too. Oil-soaked bundles of wood stood ready at intervals. When Gallic warriors approached, Romans lit the bundles and hurled them over the ramparts. The night battlefield illuminated in patches of firelight, revealing warriors caught in the death traps, revealing the scale of Gallic losses. Still they came. Shift after shift, fresh warriors replaced the exhausted. But the Romans had nowhere to rotate, no reserves. Legionaries fought until they literally collapsed from exhaustion, were dragged back from the walls, revived with water and wine, then returned to fighting. The walls held by will alone. The first night assault began at 8 p.m. Gallic commanders had calculated that darkness would neutralize Roman advantages. The death traps became harder to avoid. Warriors approaching in blackness couldn't see the Lilia pits until they fell, but Roman archers also couldn't target them accurately. It was warfare reduced to its most primitive form. Men stumbling through darkness toward walls they could barely see, defenders striking at shadows and sounds. Here's what makes the night fighting truly hellish. The oil-soaked bundles Caesar had prepared, called faces by the Romans, burned for roughly 15 minutes each. Legionaries would light them, hurl them over the ramparts, and suddenly a 100-foot radius would illuminate in orange firelight. The scenes revealed were nightmares. Warriors impaled on sippy stakes, writhing, bodies piled in Lilia pits, wounded men crawling through stimuli forests, leaving blood trails behind them. Then, after 15 minutes, darkness would swallow everything again until the next bundle was thrown. The psychological warfare was more devastating than the actual illumination. Gallic warriors advancing in darkness would suddenly be exposed in harsh firelight, visible targets for Roman arrows, visible evidence of the horrors awaiting them. Then, darkness again, and the imagination filled in what couldn't be seen. Which was worse? Seeing the death traps illuminated, or advancing blind into unknown terrors? The Gauls discovered there was no good answer. But the relief army had numbers that darkness actually favored. They rotated fresh warriors every 2 hours. At 10 p.m., a fresh wave of 10,000 replaced the exhausted initial attackers. At midnight, another rotation. At 2 a.m., another. The Gallic commanders could afford to expend men in waves because they had depth 240,000 warriors. Meant they could keep feeding fresh troops into the night assault for days if necessary. The Romans had no such luxury. The same legionaries who'd fought the noon assault were still on the walls at midnight. 18 continuous hours of combat. Centurions walked the ramparts checking their men. Legionaries were literally sleeping, standing up, propped against their shields. Some had fought so long their sword arms trembled from muscle fatigue. Vision blurred from exhaustion. Simple commands had to be repeated because exhausted minds couldn't process them the first time. Think about what this meant for Roman combat effectiveness. A fresh Gallic warrior, attacking at 2 a.m., faced a Roman legionary who'd been awake and fighting for over 24 hours straight. The physical mismatch was staggering. Only Roman discipline, the ability to fight effectively even when utterly exhausted, kept the walls intact. At 3 a.m., disaster nearly struck the northern section of the Converges. A concentrated Gallic assault. 50 warriors who'd navigated the death traps successfully reached the rampart and began scaling it with ladders. For 5 terrifying minutes, Gallic warriors actually stood on top of the Roman wall. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted on the rampart itself. Legionaries too exhausted to swing swords effectively resorted to shield bashing, pushing, wrestling anything to throw attackers back off the wall. A centurion named Marcus Petronius, name preserved in Caesar's commentaries, rallied 15 legionaries for a counterattack. They formed a wedge on the narrow rampart walkway and drove forward, shields locked. The impact threw Gallic warriors backward off the wall. Petronius himself killed 4 men in close combat, before taking a spear through the shoulder. He stayed on the wall another hour before blood loss forced him to withdraw. That single breach, held for 5 minutes, cost the Romans 37 dead and over 60 wounded. But it showed the Gauls something crucial: the walls could be scaled. Roman exhaustion was creating vulnerabilities, and breakthrough was possible. The relief army's commanders, watching from their camp, understood they'd found the formula. Continuous pressure, no respite, attacking exhausted defenders until collapse became inevitable. At dawn on October 4th, after 10 hours of continuous night fighting, Gallic war horns finally called retreat. The relief army pulled back to their camps, leaving thousands dead in the death traps and at the wall bases. Roman legionaries literally collapsed where they stood. Centurions had to physically shake men awake when Vercingetorix's forces inside Alesia launched their own dawn assault against the circumvallation. The nightmare continued. 60,000 Romans, none of whom had slept in 36 hours, now faced another day of coordinated assaults from both directions. And somewhere in the relief army's camp, Gallic scouts were reporting what they'd discovered during the night: a weakness in Caesar's defenses that could be exploited for total victory. Gallic scouts found it a weakness in Caesar's defenses. On the northwestern slope, a valley made it impossible to connect the inner and outer walls perfectly. The terrain created a gap where the fortifications were weaker, where the death traps were thinner, where 60,000 defenders became 6,000. The relief army's commanders saw the opportunity and assembled their finest troops. 60,000 elite warriors, the best from every tribe, under a brilliant commander named Vercingetorix's own cousin. They moved into position under cover of darkness. At dawn, they would hit the weak point with overwhelming force, while simultaneous attacks pinned down Romans elsewhere. The mathematics finally favored the Gauls. Caesar's brilliant double wall was about to break. The geographical reality of the northwestern sector explained everything. A steep-sided valley cut through the terrain where Caesar needed to build his contravallation. Roman engineers faced an impossible choice: bridge the valley with fortifications that would be structurally weak, or route the wall around it and create a vulnerable salient. They chose the former. The result was a section of wall roughly 800 yards long, where the rampart stood only 8 feet high instead of 12, where the ditch was 10 feet deep instead of 15, and where the death trap density was roughly half of other sectors. Here's what makes this weakness truly catastrophic. The valley's steep sides meant Caesar couldn't position supporting forts on the heights. The terrain simply didn't allow it. The nearest Roman strongpoints stood over 400 yards away on either side of the valley. That meant legionaries defending this sector couldn't receive rapid reinforcement. They would have to hold alone until help fought its way through difficult terrain. Caesar had gambled that the valley's steepness would make it unappealing as an attack route. Gallic scouts proved him wrong. Vercingetorix commanded the strike force personally. At 32 years old, he'd earned his reputation fighting Romans for a decade. He'd studied their tactics, understood their strengths, knew their limitations. He selected 60,000 warriors, not by tribe but by capability. The best climbers for navigating the valley slopes, the best shock troops for the initial assault, the most disciplined for maintaining formation under pressure. This wasn't a tribal levy. This was the Gallic equivalent of a special forces operation scaled to 60,000 men. The force composition reveals Vercingetorix's tactical brilliance. 20,000 warriors equipped with scaling ladders and grappling hooks for the wall assault. 20,000 heavy infantry to exploit any breakthrough. 20,000 reserve troops to maintain momentum once Roman lines broke. Each group had specific objectives: penetrate, expand, hold. The coordination required for 60,000 men to execute this plan was unprecedented in Gallic military history. Think about the mathematics. 6,000 Romans defending 800 yards meant roughly 7 legionaries per yard of wall. 60,000 attackers concentrated on that same frontage meant 70 Gauls per yard. A 10-to-1 local superiority despite overall Roman defensive advantages. And those 6,000 defenders had been fighting for 2 days straight with minimal sleep, minimal food, and zero reserves available. On the night of October 4th, Vercingetorix moved his force into position. 60,000 men advancing through darkness over difficult terrain required extraordinary discipline. They moved in complete silence, no talking, no metal clanking, weapons wrapped in cloth. Guides who'd scouted the route led columns along paths invisible in moonless darkness. By 3 a.m., the entire force had assembled in the valley bottom, hidden from Roman sentries on the walls above by the terrain's natural folds. The coordination plan relied on precise timing. Vercingetorix would attack the northwestern valley at dawn 6 a.m. Simultaneously, the relief army's main force would assault the Contravallation's southern sector 3 miles away. At the exact same moment, Vercingetorix's 80,000 would pour out of Alesia against the circumvallation. 3 massive assaults, 3 different locations, all hitting within minutes of each other. Caesar's ability to shift reserves, his greatest tactical advantage, would be neutralized. Every Roman would be fighting for their lives at their current position. No reinforcements, no rescue. Just hold or die. Roman sentries on the northwestern wall had no idea that 6,000 exhausted legionaries now faced 60,000 elite Gallic warriors positioned 800 yards away in the darkness. At 6 a.m., when dawn broke and Vercingetorix gave the signal, 10-to-1 odds would crash against the weakest point in Caesar's defenses. The mathematical certainty of breakthrough had finally arrived. Caesar slept 4 hours that night, his first sleep in 2 days. He would need to be at his absolute best for what dawn would bring, though he didn't yet know where the critical blow would fall. Dawn, and 60,000 Gallic elite hit the weak point like a divine fist. Simultaneously, attacks erupted along the entire 14-mile perimeter from Alesia's 80,000, from the relief army's main force. Caesar's 60,000 Romans now faced coordinated assaults, totaling 320,000 warriors, concentrated on multiple fronts. The northwestern section began to collapse. Legionaries fell back from the outer wall. Gallic warriors poured through gaps, cutting down isolated Roman units. Caesar's officers sent desperate messages. The line was breaking, the walls were lost. Request permission to retreat. For the first time in the siege, defeat seemed inevitable. Mathematics had finally overcome engineering. Numbers had beaten discipline. The weak point was becoming a floodgate, and when it opened fully, Caesar's entire army would be surrounded and annihilated. At precisely 6:07 a.m., Vercingetorix's first wave crashed into the northwestern rampart. 20,000 warriors with scaling ladders hit an 800-yard section, defended by fewer than 6,000 exhausted Romans. The ladders went up simultaneously, hundreds of them along the entire wall length. Gallic warriors swarmed upward while archers provided covering fire. Roman defenders killed the first climbers, then the second. But the third wave reached the rampart walkway. By 6:15 a.m., hand-to-hand combat raged along the wall's entire length. Here's what makes this assault unstoppable. For every Roman who killed a Gallic warrior, 3 more climbed the ladder behind him. The mathematics were brutal and simple. 6,000 defenders couldn't kill 60,000 attackers fast enough. Roman soldiers found themselves fighting multiple enemies simultaneously. Centurions screamed for their men to hold formation, but formations meant nothing when warriors were coming over the wall in waves. The thinned death traps in the valley meant Vercingetorix could feed reinforcements forward continuously. Where other sectors required warriors to navigate 400 feet of death zones, the valley approach offered relatively clear passage. Fresh Gallic troops replaced casualties almost instantly. Think about what this meant. Romans killing warriors at heroic rates still couldn't stem the tide because the supply of attackers was effectively infinite. At 6:30 a.m., the first section of wall fell completely. A 100-yard stretch where every Roman defender had been killed or driven back. Gallic warriors poured through the gap, establishing a foothold inside the Roman perimeter. They began working along the rampart from the inside, attacking adjacent Roman positions from behind. The breach was becoming a collapse. Caesar, positioned at a command post near the center of the siege lines, received the desperate messages within minutes. Northwestern sector breaking. Wall breached in 3 places. Casualties extreme. Request reinforcements immediately. But Caesar had no reinforcements to send. Every cohort was engaged, defending their own sections against simultaneous attacks from the relief army and from Alesia. By 6:45 a.m., the situation had deteriorated to catastrophic. Vercingetorix's warriors now held nearly 300 yards of the contravallation. They were inside Caesar's defenses, attacking outward along the wall and inward toward the Roman camps. The 6,000 defenders had been reduced to fewer than 4,000 one-third casualties in 40 minutes of fighting. The survivors fought in isolated pockets, surrounded, exhausted, dying. Here's what the collapse meant strategically. If Vercingetorix's force fully penetrated the contravallation, they could sweep along the interior corridor between the walls. They'd attack every Roman position from behind simultaneously. The entire 14-mile defensive system would unravel within hours. Caesar's 60,000 would be trapped in a killing zone between 320,000 enemies, with no fortifications protecting them. Roman officers watching the northwestern sector sent messages bordering on insubordination. Labienus, commanding nearby positions, wrote directly, "The line cannot hold. Request permission to withdraw south while route remains open." Other commanders echoed the sentiment. This wasn't cowardice, it was mathematical reality. The northwestern breach was the beginning of total defeat. At 7 a.m., Gallic war cries erupted from a new direction. Vercingetorix, watching Vercingetorix's success from Alesia's walls, launched his entire remaining force, 80,000 warriors, in a massive assault against the circumvallation. The Romans now fought desperately on both walls, with their northwestern sector actively collapsing. Caesar stood at his command post, receiving reports of disaster from every direction. The siege of Alesia, his masterwork of engineering and tactics, was disintegrating before his eyes. In the next 30 minutes, he would either pull off the most audacious military maneuver of his career, or watch his army die trapped between 2 walls they'd built themselves. The decision point had arrived. Caesar made a decision that defined his legend. He gathered his last reserve 13 cohorts, roughly 6,000 men, everything he had left. He mounted his distinctive scarlet-cloaked horse so every man in both armies could see him. Then he personally led the charge into the breach. Not from behind, not directing from safety. Caesar, at 50 years old, rode at the front of the counterattack into the teeth of 60,000 elite Gallic warriors. His presence electrified the wavering Romans. Legionaries who'd been falling back suddenly stopped, reformed, attacked. The German cavalry, the few who'd remained loyal, hit the Gallic flank from outside the walls. The counterattack crashed into Vercingetorix's forces with desperate fury. What happened in the next 30 minutes would decide the fate of Gaul, Rome, and Julius Caesar himself. At 7:15 a.m., Caesar assembled his reserves at the command post. 13 cohorts meant roughly 6,000 legionaries, the absolute last men available. Every other soldier was already engaged defending the walls. These 13 cohorts represented cooks, engineers, headquarters staff. Lightly wounded men returned to duty, and the strategic reserve that Caesar had desperately hoped he'd never need to commit. Sending them into the northwestern breach meant stripping every other position to skeleton crews. If this counterattack failed, there would be nothing left between the Gauls and total Roman annihilation. Here's what makes Caesar's decision truly insane. He didn't send these cohorts under subordinate command. He led them himself. At 50 years old, suffering from epilepsy that could strike without warning, Caesar mounted his horse and positioned himself at the front of the column. The scarlet military cloak, his trademark that made him instantly recognizable on any battlefield, billowed behind him as he rode toward the collapsing northwestern sector. The psychological impact was immediate and electric. Roman soldiers watching from the walls saw their commander, the man who'd conquered Gaul, who'd defeated the Germanic tribes, who'd made them all rich, with plunder riding toward the deadliest point on the battlefield. Legionaries who'd been contemplating retreat suddenly felt shame at the thought. Centurions who'd been preparing withdrawal orders instead began rallying their men for renewed assault. Caesar's presence said everything without words. We win here or we die here together. By 7:25 a.m., Caesar's column reached the breach. Vercingetorix's warriors, celebrating what they thought was victory, suddenly saw 6,000 fresh Romans charging toward them with Caesar himself in the lead. The Gallic commander made a split-second decision: wheel his forces to meet this new threat rather than continue exploiting the breach. That decision, forced by Caesar's presence, gave the surviving Roman defenders precious minutes to regroup. But here's where Caesar's tactical genius truly emerged. While he led the frontal assault into the breach, he'd coordinated with the last German cavalry loyal to Rome, roughly 800 horsemen who'd remained after the earlier betrayals. These Germans, commanded by a chieftain whose name history lost, had circled outside the contravallation and now hit Vercingetorix's forces from the flank and rear. Think about what this meant tactically. Vercingetorix's 60,000 warriors suddenly faced threats from three directions. Caesar's 6,000 charging from the south, German cavalry hammering their flank from the west, surviving Roman wall defenders attacking from the east. The Gallic numerical advantage became irrelevant in the narrow confines of the breached wall section. Only a few thousand warriors could engage simultaneously. The rest became a mob, unable to maneuver, unable to support their forward elements. The fighting that erupted at 7:30 a.m. defied description. Caesar's legionaries, knowing this was the final throw of the dice, attacked with suicidal fury. Romans who'd been defending desperately for 3 days suddenly became the attackers. The shock of momentum shift was devastating. Gallic warriors, expecting to exploit a breakthrough, instead found themselves fighting for survival against fresh troops led by Rome's greatest general. Caesar himself fought in the front ranks, a detail confirmed by multiple sources. He wielded a sword, rallied troops by voice, and exposed himself to missile fire repeatedly. At one point, a Gallic spear struck his shield so hard it embedded completely through the wood. Caesar simply grabbed a fallen legionary's shield and continued fighting. His officers, terrified for his safety, formed a protective cordon around him. Caesar ordered them back to their units. By 7:45 a.m., the mathematical reality had shifted. Vercingetorix's forces, despite their overwhelming numbers, were compressed into a killing zone where numbers became a disadvantage. Warriors couldn't swing swords without hitting their own men. Retreat meant climbing over comrades. The German cavalry carved through rear formations, creating panic. Roman legionaries, seeing Gallic cohesion collapse, pressed harder. At 7:50 a.m., Vercingetorix made the hardest decision of his life. He ordered withdrawal. The elite force that should have won, that had broken through Roman defenses, that had been minutes from total victory, retreated. Not routed, but pulled back in fighting order, bleeding from Roman pursuit every step. The breach was reclaimed. The wall was restored. Caesar's gamble had succeeded. But the battle wasn't over. Across 14 miles of fortifications, 320,000 Gauls still attacked 60,000 Romans. The northwestern sector had held, but now both armies would discover whether Caesar had any strength left for what came next. The Gallic elite broke, not slowly, but catastrophically. Caesar's charge shattered their momentum. The German cavalry butchered their flanks. Roman cohorts, sensing victory, attacked with renewed savagery. Vercingetorix's 60,000 began to run, not retreat, but full panic flight. The rout spread like plague through the relief army. When the elite warriors broke, the entire 240,000-man force lost cohesion. Warriors who'd fought for days saw their best troops fleeing and simply stopped fighting. Along all 14 miles of fortifications, Gallic attacks faltered, then collapsed. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix watched the relief army disintegrate. His last hope evaporated before his eyes. The siege had held. Rome had won. The pursuit began. The psychological collapse happened with stunning speed. At 8 a.m., Vercingetorix's elite force was still fighting an organized withdrawal. By 8:15 a.m., organized withdrawal had become panicked flight. By 8:30 a.m., the entire northwestern sector had devolved into a mob of terrified warriors streaming away from Roman positions. The German cavalry pursued with merciless efficiency, cutting down fleeing Gauls who'd abandoned shields and weapons to run faster. Here's what makes the collapse truly catastrophic. Word of the elite forces' defeat spread through the relief army faster than messengers could ride. Warriors attacking the southern sectors saw streams of fleeing comrades. The tribal contingents, each fighting for their own chiefs, not truly unified, made individual decisions to withdraw. The Aedui pulled back first, then the Arverni, then the Sequani. Within an hour, the coordinated assault that should have destroyed Caesar had become 240,000 individuals seeking only escape. The contagion of panic reached Alesia's walls by 9 a.m. Vercingetorix, watching from the ramparts, saw the relief army he'd summoned, the greatest military force Gaul had ever assembled, streaming away from Roman fortifications in complete disorder. His 80,000 warriors, who'd been preparing another assault against the circumvallation, simply stopped. Officers tried rallying them. Vercingetorix himself descended from the walls to give orders. But morale had shattered. If 60,000 elite warriors couldn't break Caesar's defenses, what hope did they have? Think about what this meant for Gallic psychology. They'd believed in the mathematics of overwhelming force. 240,000 plus 80,000 versus 60,000 should have been mathematically certain victory. When those numbers failed, when Rome's engineering and discipline defeated Gaul's numerical superiority, the psychological foundation of the entire rebellion collapsed. Roman pursuit transformed victory into massacre. Caesar unleashed his cavalry, the loyal Germans, plus what remained of his Gallic mercenaries in unrestricted chase. They'd been held in reserve throughout the siege, fresh and eager for vengeance after the earlier betrayals. Now they thundered after fleeing Gauls, cutting down warriors too exhausted to defend themselves. The killing continued for miles. Fleeing warriors threw away armor to run faster. Discarded shields, swords, and spears littered the landscape like a trail marking Gallic desperation. The casualty differential tells the story of complete defeat. Roman observers estimated 80,000 Gauls killed during the 3 days of assaults on the walls, death traps, arrow fire, hand-to-hand combat. Another 90,000 died in the rout and pursuit over the following 2 days. Think about those numbers. 170,000 casualties out of a 240,000-man army, a 70% casualty rate. The relief force that was supposed to save Alesia had been effectively annihilated. By October 7th, the pursuit ended. German cavalry returned to Roman lines, driving thousands of prisoners before them. The survivors of the relief army, perhaps 70,000 warriors, had scattered across Gaul, fleeing toward their home territories. They would never reassemble. The largest army Gaul had ever fielded no longer existed as a fighting force. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix faced mathematical reality. His 80,000 warriors had been on starvation rations for weeks. The relief army was destroyed. No rescue was coming. The Romans, despite 3 days of desperate combat, still held both walls intact. Food inside the fortress would last perhaps 5 more days. After that, his warriors would be too weak to lift weapons. That night, Vercingetorix called his chieftains to council. The question was simple and terrible: die fighting in a hopeless breakout attempt, or surrender and hope for Roman mercy. The debate lasted hours. Some chiefs argued for a final battle, better to die as warriors than slaves. Others pointed to the mathematical impossibility. They'd just watched 60,000 elite troops fail to break Caesar's defenses. What chance did starving warriors have? The decision reached at dawn would end free Gaul forever. The slaughter of the retreat exceeded the battle itself. Roman cavalry hunted fleeing Gauls for miles. Exhausted warriors were cut down by thousands. No mercy, No quarter, these were Caesar's orders. The relief army that had numbered 240,000 was destroyed as an organized force. Estimates of Gallic dead: 80,000 in the assaults on the walls, another 90,000 in the rout and pursuit. Roman losses: 12,000 across the entire siege. Think about those numbers. 170,000 Gauls dead, 12,000 Romans. A 14-to-1 kill ratio achieved through engineering, discipline, and Caesar's presence on the battlefield at the critical moment. The fields around Alesia were carpeted with corpses. The greatest battle ever fought on Gallic soil had ended in Rome's most complete victory. The casualty breakdown reveals the true horror of Alesia. Of the 80,000 killed during the wall assaults, Roman engineers later estimated that 35,000 died in the death traps impaled on Lilia stakes, crippled by stimuli, or caught in sippy barriers before ever reaching Roman shields. Another 25,000 fell to arrow fire from the ramparts. Only 20,000 actually died in hand-to-hand combat with legionaries. Caesar's engineered defenses had killed almost twice as many Gauls as his soldiers did. Here's what makes those numbers truly staggering. The death traps required 0 Roman casualties to operate. A warrior falling into a Lilia pit didn't kill a single Roman in the process. The 35,000 who died in the obstacles represented pure advantage enemy casualties inflicted at no cost. Traditional siege warfare expected defenders to lose men at roughly equal rates to attackers. Caesar had turned that equation upside down. The pursuit casualties tell an even darker story. 90,000 Gauls died fleeing the battlefield over 3 days of relentless chase. Roman and German cavalry hunted them across 50 miles of countryside. Fleeing warriors, exhausted from 3 days of combat, couldn't run far or fight back effectively. They died in ravines, in forests, along riverbanks. Some drowned trying to swim rivers. Others collapsed from exhaustion and were killed where they fell. The German cavalry particularly showed no mercy. These were the warriors who'd watched their comrades betray them earlier in the siege. Their vengeance was total. Think about the scale of this massacre. 90,000 dead in pursuit means roughly 30,000 killed per day over 3 days. That's over 1,000 deaths per hour, every hour, for 72 consecutive hours. The killing continued from dawn to dusk as cavalry ranging farther from Alesia each day found new clusters of fleeing Gauls. Roman casualties, by contrast, revealed the effectiveness of defensive engineering. 12,000 losses across the entire siege meant roughly 4,000 per day during the 3 days of maximum combat. But here's the critical detail. Over half of those casualties, roughly 7,000, occurred in the northwestern sector during Vercingetorix's breakthrough attempt. The rest of the 14-mile perimeter, protected by full-strength fortifications and death traps, had held with minimal losses. The casualty ratio becomes even more impressive when examined by sector. Sections with complete death trap coverage saw ratios approaching 30-to-1. The northwestern breach, where death traps were thinner, still achieved 8-to-1 despite being the main breakthrough point. Caesar's engineering had multiplied Roman combat effectiveness by factors unprecedented in ancient warfare. The aftermath presented logistical nightmares. 170,000 corpses don't simply disappear. The fields surrounding Alesia became charnel houses. Bodies lay so thick in some areas that movement required stepping over or on the dead. The Lilia pits, filled with impaled corpses, created forests of death that had to be cleared before Roman forces could maneuver. The smell became unbearable within days. That many decomposing bodies in autumn heat created a stench detectable miles away. Caesar ordered systematic burial details, not from respect for the dead, but from practical necessity. Disease would ravage his own army if the bodies remained. Legionaries spent a week digging mass graves. The numbers defied imagination. Burial pits large enough for thousands of bodies, arranged in rows across the landscape. Later generations would call these the Fields of Mars, where Gallic resistance had died in industrial quantities. But the human cost extended beyond simple death counts. 43 tribes had sent their warriors to Alesia. Many sent their entire military-age male population. those tribes would never recover demographically. Villages across Gaul had lost entire generations in 3 days of slaughter. The social fabric of Gallic civilization had been torn beyond repair. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix knew these numbers. His scouts had watched the massacre unfold. He understood that even if he somehow escaped, there was no Gallic army left to command. The relief force that represented Gaul's last hope had been annihilated so completely that resistance was no longer militarily possible. Only one question remained. How would he end this? The next morning, the gates of Alesia opened. Vercingetorix emerged alone, mounted on a magnificent horse, wearing his finest armor. He rode down the hill in complete silence. The man who had united Gaul, who had nearly destroyed Caesar, who had led the greatest rebellion against Rome, dismounted before Caesar's tribunal and laid down his weapons. No words were spoken. Caesar had him clapped in chains. Vercingetorix would spend 6 years in a Roman prison, then be strangled during Caesar's triumph parade. The Gallic chieftains inside Alesia were divided as slaves among the legions, 1 prisoner for each Roman soldier, a bonus paid in human flesh. Free Gaul died that day. Within a year, the entire territory was a Roman province. Caesar had gambled everything on 2 walls and won an empire. The surrender ceremony occurred at 10 a.m. on October 8th. Vercingetorix had spent the night preparing himself for what came next. He bathed, put on ceremonial armor inlaid with gold, and mounted the finest horse in Alesia's stables. The ride down from the fortress took 15 minutes. 80,000 defeated Gallic warriors watched from the walls. 60,000 victorious Romans watched from the circumvallation. Not a sound broke the morning air except the horses' hooves on stone. Here's what makes this surrender historically unique. Vercingetorix offered no excuses, made no pleas, spoke no defiant last words. He simply dismounted, removed his sword belt, laid his weapons at Caesar's feet, and knelt. The gesture was deliberate. He was offering himself as sacrifice to save his warriors from total massacre. By surrendering personally and dramatically, he hoped Caesar might show mercy to the men inside Alesia. Caesar's response was coldly pragmatic. He ordered Vercingetorix chained immediately, heavy iron shackles on wrists and ankles. The Gallic leader who'd united a continent, who'd nearly destroyed Rome's greatest general, was reduced to a prisoner within seconds. Guards dragged him to a cage where he would remain for 6 years. His fate was sealed. The moment he knelt, he would be kept alive until Caesar could parade him through Rome in chains, then ritually strangled in the Tullianum prison as the final act of Caesar's triumph ceremony. But Vercingetorix's sacrifice saved nothing. Caesar's terms for the 80,000 warriors inside Alesia were brutally simple. Total enslavement. Every warrior, every chieftain, every nobleman who'd fought for Gallic freedom became Roman property. Caesar divided them mathematically, 1 slave for each of his 60,000 legionaries as bonus payment for their endurance during the siege. Think about what this meant. 80,000 men who'd been free warriors woke up as slaves, distributed like equipment to the very soldiers who defeated them. The economic value was staggering. A healthy male slave sold for approximately 500 denarii in Roman markets. 80,000 slaves represented 40 million denarii in value, enough wealth to pay Caesar's entire army for 2 years. But Caesar gave them directly to his legionaries, cementing their loyalty with human property. It was political genius, wrapped in human tragedy. The tribal implications extended far beyond Alesia's walls. The 43 tribes that had sent warriors to the relief army now faced Roman retribution. Caesar sent legions to each tribal territory with simple demands: submit completely or be annihilated. Without military-age males dead at Alesia or enslaved inside it, the tribes had no ability to resist. One by one, they surrendered. The Aedui, the Arverni, the Sequani, every major tribe that had fought for independence became Roman subjects within 6 months. By spring of 51 BC, all of Gaul was a Roman province. The transformation was total and permanent. Gallic languages would survive, Gallic culture would endure, but Gallic political independence was finished. 3 million people now answered to Rome. The territory that had taken Caesar 7 years of warfare to subdue would remain Roman for 500 years. Here's what makes Alesia strategically decisive beyond the immediate military victory. Caesar's success in Gaul gave him the wealth, the veteran legions, and the political prestige to challenge the Roman Republic itself. Within 5 years, he would cross the Rubicon and plunge Rome into civil war. The same engineering genius, the same tactical brilliance, the same ability to inspire loyalty that won at Alesia would make him dictator of Rome. Gaul's defeat created the Roman Empire. Vercingetorix, the 26-year-old chieftain who'd nearly changed history, spent 6 years in a Roman cell. In 46 BC, Caesar finally held his Gallic triumph, a massive parade through Rome celebrating his conquest. Vercingetorix, wearing chains, was displayed to cheering Roman crowds as the symbol of defeated barbarism. After the parade, executioners strangled him in the Tullianum, the ancient prison beneath the Forum. He died as he'd surrendered in silence, without plea or protest. The siege of Alesia ended more than a rebellion. It ended an era. 60,000 Romans, through engineering brilliance and disciplined courage, had defeated 320,000 Gauls and conquered a continent. 2 walls, 14 miles of fortifications, and Caesar's presence at the critical moment had achieved what should have been mathematically impossible. Free Gaul died between those walls, and the Roman Empire was born.